Hello and welcome to Tête-à-Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is David Miliband. He's the president of the International Rescue Committee and he's a former British Foreign Secretary, and he joins us from New York City. Thank you very much, Mr. Miliband.
Thank you.
I want to begin with Syria. Obviously, the humanitarian situation is dire, especially with millions of Syrian displaced refugees and possibly eager to return home. We know aid delivery was a major problem for humanitarian organizations under the Assad regime. Is this changing right now? And is this the moment really to scale up humanitarian aid into Syria?
Well, yes, everything is changing in Syria at the moment. The civil war has obviously ravaged the country, 7 million refugees, including in Europe, 6 or 7 million people displaced inside the country. We've been working there, the International Rescue Committee, inside northwest Syria and in northeast Syria for the last 13 years during the civil war. Now, I think it's very important to remember that we never took the country of Syria off our annual emergency watch list. Even when people were saying the war's over, Assad has won, we always pointed to the extreme humanitarian needs, 16 million people needing help from non-governmental organizations like us to survive. Now, the situation today is transformed at a governance level, obviously, and there is, for the first time in a long time, some hope among Syrians. I heard from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees that 1 million people have returned to Syria, as well as several 100,000 or maybe 100,000 who've actually left. So it's still a tumultuous situation, but the constriction on aid delivery that's been a feature of the last 13 years, the closing of aid border crossing points by the Assad regime, the lack of cross-conflict line delivery of aid, and the continued military action, especially in the northwest of the country, that has made aid delivery extremely difficult. And that situation should now be transformed. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the needs are over. I think that the first step is obviously the formation of a government. We know the new Prime Minister designate from his work in Idlib province where we were working. And we were able to carry on our work in Idlib province. That needs to become the norm across the country. There's obviously the danger of hyperinflation. So secondly, the economic challenge. And then thirdly, the need to meet people's needs, sustaining the health system, tending for refugees who are arriving back to find their homes destroyed. Those are important tasks that need coordination and effective collaboration between the government and international agencies and local people who are the people we work with.
Right. You mentioned the fact that you were present in the Idlib province. Obviously, now the leadership there is now the leadership, the de facto leadership of Syria, especially the transition Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir. So give us your assessment of how it is working for them. Do they respect minorities? Do they respect humanitarian law? Or are there some serious issues with the way they govern?
Well, I can only report on our own experience. We had around 400 people working in northwestern Syria. Obviously, the population of that part of Syria, just for the benefit of your viewers, the population was originally 2 to 2.5 million, but 1 to 1.5 million Syrians were driven into Idlib province from elsewhere in the country during the course of the civil war. It became the last redoubt, if you like, of the rebel anti-government factions there. Now, our experience was that we were able to get on with our work in a reasonable way. We were not told which clients to serve and which clients not to serve. Our money and our goods and our aid was able to find its way to people who needed it. It wasn't diverted. So at that level, obviously, it was a professional relationship. And I would say that in the later years of the, until a month or two ago, the professionalism of the civil authorities that were in charge of Idlib province grew. Their ability to work with international organizations, especially after the earthquake in February 2023. You remember the earthquake across the Syria-Turkey border. Since then, there's been particular close connection with the civil authorities. Obviously, there's a whole range of other wider political issues, but the words that are being used by the new governing authorities about Syria being a place for all Syrians is obviously important, because the wider economic and political situation in Idlib was very contested over the period of the civil war.
Right. Are you concerned about Syrians being pushed out from neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and also by European countries very quickly saying they were suspending asylum procedures? Are you concerned by that?
Well, obviously, the arrival of 3 million Syrians in Turkey, more than 1 million Syrians in Lebanon, between 500 and 1,000 and 1 million Syrians in Jordan, that's been an enormous burden on those countries. And Germany has 780,000 Syrians. The UK, my country, has far fewer in Europe. But you're right to see this as a big issue. From our point of view, it's very important that return is voluntary. We don't want to get into a deportation situation. Equally, one can understand that an asylum adjudication has to be made on the basis of whether it's safe for people to return home. It clearly wasn't safe under the Assad regime. People are especially worried that their sons would be dragooned into the Assad army. Now it's a much more open situation. We stand behind the principle that successful return is voluntary return, and I think it's very important that that's upheld.
Right. You're publishing your yearly watch list of global humanitarian crises, obviously, and sadly, it's a long list. But I just want to focus on Sudan. Sudan is in the midst of what can only be called a civil war. And you say in the report that 10% of people in humanitarian need around the world are in Sudan, a country that only has 1% of the world's population. What is going on inside Sudan?
Well, this is a very important point. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak to it. Our annual watch list looks forward to the 20 countries at greatest risk of humanitarian disaster in the year ahead. 82% of the total number of people in humanitarian need in the world live in those 20 countries. So 305 million people in humanitarian need around the world, more than 80% of them just in those 20 countries. And top of the list is Sudan, so it's a very good topic. Sudan is the avatar, it's the symbol, it's the representation of modern humanitarian need today, because it's based on, first, a dire conflict, a civil war, as you say, going on since April 2023. Secondly, the climate crisis, important part of Sudan's trauma. Thirdly, economic collapse related to the war and to the climate situation, the climate crisis. The situation in Sudan is very easy to describe. Two factions of the former governing elite are now at war with each other, and they are tyrannizing and terrorizing the population, and they're able to do so, and this is what makes it a very modern representation of humanitarian need. The two sides are able to fight their civil war because of the support of regional powers. This isn't an American creation, it's not a Chinese creation, but regional powers plus Russia are supporting each side and convincing each side that they have room to win this war. And the price is being paid by civilians, obviously. 30 million, as you indicate, in humanitarian need, 10% of the total number in humanitarian need around the world. But it's also being paid by neighboring countries. There's 1 million refugees have gone into Chad, to the west of Sudan. Eastern Chad now has a very significant number of Sudanese, but also South Sudan, to the south of Sudan, as the name indicates, over 500,000 people going to Sudan, some of them formerly South Sudanese, but others Sudanese. And so this is the gravest humanitarian challenge that's faced. It's not just the largest humanitarian catastrophe today, it's the largest humanitarian catastrophe in history. And our report is both a warning, but also a call to action on the humanitarian side of aid delivery, opening up the crossing points and the conflict lines to allow aid to flow, especially to those in areas that are threatened with famine, which is a real and present danger in the west of Sudan today, but also at the political level, because as long as the arms are flowing to support each side, it's going to be very hard to see how this war ends.
Just a last point. Obviously, there are mounting humanitarian needs, but there's shrinking money. around the world, even in countries generous like Northern Europe, Germany, and obviously with the return of Donald Trump to the White House and his close advisor, what can use that word, Elon Musk, questioning whether the U.S. should abandon foreign aid, there's a big question mark on how those needs will be addressed in the near future. Are you worried?
Yes, you're making a very important point. There's obviously a moral argument that we make that the fraction of global income that goes to the world's most vulnerable is money that's well spent and needs to be increased, not decreased. But the political riptide is obviously against that. There are more needs. You know, in Europe, that European budgets are strained by the war in Ukraine. That's the number one priority. Our point, though, is there's a moral argument for the direction of international aid towards the most vulnerable. And of course, the figures are much smaller. Just to give you an example from Europe, the European Commission humanitarian budget is less than $3 billion, but the European economy is a $25 trillion economy. So these are small fractions of the total size of the economy, and I think it's very important to make that case. However, I'd also make the case, not just morally, but strategically. What the Syria case shows in Technicolor is that untended humanitarian crisis leads to political instability, not just in the country where it comes from, but far beyond. The fact that Jordan and Lebanon were never properly supported for the refugee hosting is part of the explanation, a significant part of the explanation for Europe's refugee crisis in 2015-16. So this is a smart investment, not just a moral investment. It's one that needs to be directed in very focused ways and ways that deliver value for money, which we think can be done, and we give examples in our report of how it could be so.
David Miliband, that's all we had time for. Thank you very much for being our guest from New York. Thank you all for watching this edition of Tête à Tête.